Welcome to Run the Adventure, a podcast about getting the most out of published modules for your tabletop role-playing game. I'm your host, Sid Razavi. Every episode, I take a look at a module to show you where the fun is and how you might want to tweak it to suit your game. I hope even if you decide not to play this particular adventure, you'll get some interesting ideas out of it. The following content is aimed at games masters, or players who want to be games masters. So, if this is an adventure you want to play, this is the point I should warn you that there's going to be a lot of spoilers up ahead. But if you're ready to step behind the screen, then there is no better time to start than right now. I've been running games for over 30 years now, but my aim with every episode is to put myself in the shoes of a new GM. As well as breaking the scenario down and telling you how it plays, I'll be peppering the discussion with useful advice for the relatively new GM who has to try to run this for their group. I hope the discussion will also prove interesting for veteran GMs who are looking for ideas for their own games. Now, if you've listened to previous episodes before and liked what you've heard, can I ask a bit of a favor? Would you be able to post a review on iTunes, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever it is you get your podcasts? It would really help get the word out there and be a bit of encouragement for me as well. Also, if you can share your favorite episode so far on social media, that would be great. Thank you. But if this is your first episode, welcome, and I hope you like what you hear. I'd love to hear any feedback you've got. Okay, now that's all out of the way, let's get to this episode's adventure. For this episode, I'll be talking about the Call of Cthulhu scenario, Amidst the Ancient Trees, which comes with the 7th edition Keeper's Handbook. Set in 1925 Vermont, this is a scenario that models the kind of creeping cosmic horror that is particularly enjoyable to play with Call of Cthulhu. It blends sandbox exploration with the relentless march of events that drives the plot to its terrifying conclusion. Something the players will be keen to stop if they can. There is a lot to unpack and learn from this scenario, and it is not without its challenges to run. So this is a particularly useful scenario for a keeper to try their hand at adapting once they run something like The Haunting, the subject of episode 2 of this podcast.
Summary of the adventure.
In the summer of 1925 in sleepy Bennington, Vermont, a search posse is being formed after the daughter of a local industrialist, Lucas Strong, is kidnapped by Sidney Harris and his gang. The night before our investigators are pulled into the matter, a ransom handoff has gone terribly wrong with a shootout between the gang members and the police. The surviving gang members had then disappeared into the nearby woods with the young girl never being returned. Today, when we pick up the story, Lucas Strong has offered a generous bounty for the return of Jane, his daughter. This is the basis upon which our investigating player characters are brought in. However, there is a lot more going on here in rural southwest Vermont than a simple kidnapping gone wrong. There are, in fact, several threads upon which the story is woven, and being aware how they fit together is going to be vital to making the most of this adventure. Let us start with the top-level criminal investigation. Mr. Strong, the new head of the Vermont Water Board, has drawn the attention of Sidney Harris's gang because of rumors that the new dig site for the Somerset Reservoir has found precious metals. Harris and his gang takes this precious metals to be gold, and so they figured Strong would be good for the ransom. However, the metals found have defied analysis. In fact, the threat of toxicity has halted the reservoir project and threatens to ruin Lucas Strong, who has sunk so much of his own funds into it. Still, Strong intended to pay to get his daughter back. The police were merely there to facilitate, and it wasn't any action on their part that caused the exchange to go sideways. Something else spooked the gang, for the nearby lake in the woods is home to one of the great old ones, Glaki, who fell to Earth millennia ago in a meteorite containing its crystal prison. Shards of this prison fell all across all the Earth, with one lesser piece landing in Vermont. As long as the shards remained unbroken, Glahki would be held in its crystalline prison. But over the millennia, the malevolent entity has worked hard to seek those shards and project itself into bodies of water, where when reunited with the shards, it could destroy them and work to release itself. By drawing in the local inhabitants to do its bidding through their dreams, Glahki is able to manifest itself to convert them into undead servants. In 1865, this is what happened to a group of Union Army deserters fleeing into the Vermont woods. Led by Joseph Turner, they had hoped to escape the Civil War and flee to Canada, but instead, they were lured by the Great Old One to be its servants. For 60 years, Turner and the other servants drawn to Glahki have searched for the crystal shard, but it was not until Strong's surveyors dug it out did they find it. The surveyors have now themselves been lured by the Great Old One and become its undead servants. Yet, as recent converts, they have not taken the full appearance of undeath. When the Harris gang used the woods to hide Strong's daughter, they too started receiving the dream call of Glahki. This left them in a disturbed state and twitchy. Their sense of reality warped. Something spooked them during the handoff. Already on the edge of madness, they withdrew back into the woods, only to find Jane Strong had been taken by someone else, and the gang member left to guard her, brutally eviscerated. Now, the investigators have a short window to find Harris or his accomplices, discover where Jane Strong is being held, and return her to her father. Every night they spend in those woods, they will risk being pulled into the Great Old One's dreaming.
Adventure structure.
The scenario provides a detailed background, beginning with the Great Old One's fall to Earth, continuing with the story of Turner and the other Civil War deserters, before moving on to recent events involving Mr. Strong, the Vermont Water Board, and the Harris Gang. This is particularly well written and enjoyable to read. I strongly recommend making some notes as you do so. There is a timeline that is particularly helpful and a list of non-player characters of note to make sense of the whole background. Assuming your group is playing with new investigators, there are 4 suggested motivations for the investigators that should be distributed prior to the start of the game and incorporated into their backstory. If you have more than 4 players, or these are not new investigators, you will have to find your own motivations for getting them to Bennington and involved. This will be a challenge if you hope to get them past the strange things that will deter them from going forward. I don't think simple academic curiosity is going to work here, and some personal ties to Mr. Strong or the Harris Gang are going to be essential. The actual adventure is broken down by days in which various scenes are expected to play out. On day 1, the party are called to the office of the sheriff in Bennington and briefed about the posse being formed. The investigators then have some opportunity to do some looking around town and find out some background information, as well as pick up some needed supplies. Then, after heading out of town towards the woods, they will join the rest of the searchers on the edge of the woods. Once assigned to a team of their fellow investigators, they can pick up the trail and enter the woods. Personally, I tend to skip the briefing in the sheriff's office, as I find shopping and mooching around town preludes detract from the fun, especially when time is short and you're trying to fit this into 1 or 2 sessions. As I discussed in the previous episode on the Lost Mine of Phandelver, I'm a fan of adventure designs which put the party right in the midst of things as quickly as possible. So instead of being briefed in town, I start with the investigators meeting outside the woods, having already received a briefing about the purpose of the search party. Their existing background ties to Mr. Strong or the Harris gang will simply reinforce that. They should already come fully equipped as part of character creation. You should forewarn them that this will be a wilderness exploration into some woods. As the posse is forming, they can question the sheriff and his deputies, investigate the crime scene from the shootout the night before, and get to know each other a little bit if this is the first time the investigators have worked together. This is also a good moment to introduce them to a rival team within the posse that can be used in a scene later on. I had some fun contrasting my typically more erudite investigators with some good old boys who didn't think much of the city folks' chances of finding jack shit in the woods. After the posse is formed, they begin their search by following the tracks left by Harris. In a short while, the investigators will find the remnant of a pair of father and son hunting party, spooked by bad dreams. They will fire on the investigators in their distressful state. Mistaking them for what is not clear, as they are no longer in the mood for hunting and are trying to make their way out of the forest. The chances of being shot dead in that first encounter are pretty negligible, as the glancing shot by the nervous George Lawson is more an introduction to the danger they face than anything else. Still, the nervous disposition of his son George, the bad dreams they report of having, and the fact that they are leaving behind the other father and son pair, which they went into the woods with, should put the investigators on alert. Something isn't right here. The rest of the day's trek into the woods will be uneventful, although the sense of moving through wilder woodland should be emphasized. The party will have little choice but to camp in the woods, receiving the first of a series of ever more disturbed dreams that portend to great evil ahead. The dreams at least some of the investigators will be sent directly from Glaki, but they are unlikely to be deterred very much, and instead they will just be a little bit more on edge as the second day comes around. The second day is when the investigation really gets underway. Assuming a fairly linear progression through the woods, they will stumble across the murdered body of an artist, one of a group from Miskatonic University, who have come to a retreat and to paint the ancient woods themselves. The investigators will see a trail of blood that leads them to a knife abandoned by the killer some distance away, whilst the trail of footprints left by the dead man will take them to the artist's campsite. There, amongst the abandoned tents, are obvious signs of struggle. Several clues lie about the tents, hinting at the ominous ancient evil in the area. Amongst them are several prophetic pictures of the lake and a spooky-looking cabin. Whether heading for the artist's camp or continuing their search for Harris and his gang, it is likely the investigators will come across a trail of tire tracks in the forest floor. Following it, they will hear the sound of an engine starting and come to a truck used by James Stanton, one of Mr. Strong's surveyors. Although already a servant of Glaki, he is in the early stages of the transformation and will invite the investigators back to the dig site to answer any questions they may have. He will not offer to give them a ride, as he will not be keen to be in too close proximity with them given his condition. Exactly how enticing this visit to the dig site may be to the investigators at this point depends on the level of tension and unease they feel about staying in the woods another night. By about dusk, the investigators will find themselves being shot at by a desperate Eugene Clayton, who will try to warn them off. Lucky investigators will spot him before he does, and may get the jump on him. If he is cornered or chased down, he will cooperate. Wounded from the previous encounter with the police, He will try to pin the blame on Harris, portraying himself as an unwitting patsy. The investigators can obtain from Clayton two important pieces of information. One, that Jane Strong was alive last time he saw her, and two, she is being held captive in a hideout cabin to which he will happily direct the investigators. One thing to emphasize in between major scenes is the ominous presence of the forest and the challenge posed by navigating this wild wood. A challenge that will only get worse as the environment gets darker and stranger. The forest is out to get them, subtly at first, and more so as the day presses on. Navigating the forest becomes increasingly more difficult, and at night, the preternatural effects make it even more challenging. It is unavoidable that the party will need to rest again in the open, although they may try to push through the night for a time before realizing they are becoming exhausted and lost. It is during their second night's sleep they will have their most sanity-breaking dreams. Besides the dreams sent by the Great Old One, there is also a loud explosion and a brilliant blue light that fills the night sky. They are also being watched by one of these servants, one of Turner's gang. The creature will make his escape if discovered, but the party will either know or feel they are being surveilled by someone else in the woods. Soon after this, they will encounter another posse team who will be heading out. As I mentioned earlier, it is not a bad idea to foreshadow this second team in the first scene by the edge of the woods before the party set out. Give them some personality and even make them hostile to the player characters. So, when they meet, the interaction will prove meaningful and potentially violent. Both sides will be jumpy, and it's not unreasonable somebody will shoot first in the dark. Moving in the forest at night is fraught with danger. Pulled by Glacky's dreams and trying to find their way through the warped woods, the investigators may be drawn unwittingly to the lake. Alternatively, if they have found the trail to the dig site, they may try to push on despite their tiredness, hoping for safety. Of course, warn them they are tired, and some penalties will apply if they are ever to be tested. They may be incredulous at how long walking towards the dig site takes, or the fact that they get turned around every so often as they try to leave the woods. But by this point, they are swimming against the Great Old One's currents. If they wait until the next day to move on, their choices remain to follow Harris's trail or Eugene Clayton's directions towards that hideout cabin, or they can head to the artist's camp or go straight to the dig site. When they wake, they find the forest has taken on a surreal quality and color. Worse, there is no bird song or other sounds of nature at all. Matters will now escalate rapidly, and by nightfall on the third night, the situation will resolve itself one way or another. What path the investigators will take is up to them, but several seem likely at this point. One, perhaps the sanest, is to try to leave the woods without the girl or Harris. This would be anticlimactic, and I suspect players rarely, dare I say ever, choose this option. Alternatively, if they get the information from Clayton or simply elect to head in that direction by following Harris's tracks, they may come across the hideout. There they find the corpse of Christopher Dobbs, the gang member left to guard Jane Strong. The body has been gruesomely eviscerated and hung as a warning. This may distract the investigators from the fact that Sidney Harris is hiding in that cabin. Crazed by Cree's dreams, he thinks the investigators have taken the girl, but the girl was taken by the servants the night before. The investigators may also follow the trail of the dead artist and come to the artist's camp on the third day. This will be their biggest clue that there is a lake where something dark and strange is occurring. Some of the paintings echo the dreams they received during the night. Beyond these points of interest, there are two paths open to them. One is to follow the path taken by the truck towards the dig site. I will come back to that later. The other way, open to the investigators, is to take the less used trail going eastwards. The eastern trail leads to the cabin of Turner, the Civil War deserter. This is the place about which some of the investigators will have had very foreboding dreams. If despite this they decide to go inside the cabin, they will find caskets basking in pale blue light. During the day, 2 of the caskets will have 2 of the Turner's gang resting in them, but the rest will be empty. At night, they will all be empty. There are enough clues here to begin piecing together what happened to Turner and his fellow deserters. However, the place is rife with eldritch power, and the investigators may find themselves overwhelmed by the visions from Key. The 2 undead servants, if they are about, will rise and try to convince them to join their cause, taking them to the lake if they can. Assuming the investigators press on to the lake, they will find a horrific scene before them. The artists who were captured have been placed in stomach-churning state as offerings on poles waiting for their conversions to servants of the Great Old One. This scene on the lake is also what lies in store for the investigators if they are ever captured, which, if they went with the 2 undead from Turner's gang, is likely what will happen to them when reinforcements from the dig site arrive. It is possible the investigators may sneak upon the lakeside and merely observe or help the not quite yet dead artists obtain some release. But this depends on how lucky they turn out to be, for the lake is not entirely unwatched. The Great Old One's servants are nearby at the dig site. Getting captured is the most likely possibility of what will happen to them if they head to the dig site. The surveyors resemble enough of their former humanity that the investigators may not initially suspect them. In fact, given everything else going on, they may be relieved to find some sign of civilization out there. The leader of the surveyors, Carl White, will give them a credible story and invite them to stay for the night. So they may be willingly led to the cabin on the site, where they will find out the fate of Jane Strong. When placed in this darkened cabin, they will learn from Jane Strong, or the missing father and son hunting party, what is likely in store for them. For soon Turner and his gang, plus the former workers of the dig site, will try to capture the investigators, and then, in due course, take them to the lake. There they will share the fate of the artists, perhaps living long enough to see the crystal dragged to the lake and see Key rise again. Alternatively, there is a chance the investigators will approach the dig site more cautiously and stealthily and attempt to disrupt the servants' plans before destroying the crystal. This would at least delay the Great Old One's return to the world. Many would be content with the consolation of successfully rescuing Jane Strong from the dig site and taking her out safely back to her father. If such a happy ending is possible, it seems highly improbable.
Where the fun is at.
Personally, I love forests, and I love stories where people are lost in them, dealing with gnarly things. There is something primeval about the woods of the Amidst the Ancient Trees. I relish the opportunity to describe an atmospheric setting which at first only hints at the cosmic horror buried within. So the theme alone is something that inspired me and excited me to run this adventure. The scenario is very well paced, with the 3 days being distinctive in the level of anxiety-inducing tension they introduce. Depending on how long your game sessions last, you may need to divide the scenario into at least 2 parts. I tried both splitting the scenario in the middle of the second day, just after the artist's body was discovered, and after the dreams but before the explosion during the second night. Both worked well. There are a number of very memorable scenes. The early scene with the father and son hunting party is a great opener for what will follow. The artist camp with the creepy paintings also stands out in my memory. The final scene by the lake is terrifying. As the rich details of the scenes and deep background suggest, there is a large cast of characters from which to sculpt the narrative. From the opening with the sheriff and Mr. Strong, through the encounters with those caught in the Great Old One's web, to the frightened hard men that are Sidney Harris and Eugene Clayton. The day 3 scenes all escalate the weirdness and tension to near breaking point. This is where GMs will have a bit of a challenge on their hands. Once the dig site becomes an option and the encounter with the truck would certainly bring it fresh to mind, many sensible investigators will want to head for its perceived safety. So it becomes quite easy to abandon the search for Sidney Harris and Jane Strong. Even if they pursue Harris to his cabin, it seems quite likely they will mistake it for the cabin in their dreams. With so many foreboding premonitions around a cabin in the woods, plus the gruesome sight of Christopher Dobbs outside, it would be fairly surprising if they enter the cabin. Of course, if they do, Harris provides a wonderful opportunity for an encounter with someone who has been all too close to the servants and yet survived. The adventure suggests having him descend into hysterics, but I would suggest an alternative, subtler take, which might serve better. A quiet madness, like that of Colonel Kurtz in Apocalypse Now. It might provide a more interesting scene. The artist's camp and Turner's cabin are both fairly optional scenes for the party, but which can increase the eldritch terror in subtle and not so subtle ways. As I mentioned, the finale of the adventure is likely to occur in the dig site. If the party have held their nerve so far and are suspicious enough, they may get to explore the site and even do something dramatic to thwart the servants. I think this possibility, though, is pretty slim. By the time the party gets to the dig site, they are likely to be spooked and easily corralled into the hut. Even a well-armed bunch of investigators will struggle to fight their way out. They are likely outnumbered and already in a bad spot. The sensible thing may well be to wait for a better opportunity to escape, but I find player characters tend to fall into 2 types. Bookish types who are already losing their minds by this point, or sock'em clock'em types armed to the teeth, who will fight as soon as they are threatened with being disarmed. Firefights against undead servants don't go particularly well when they have the numbers. The kind of investigator who will take to being captured and have the wherewithal to organize an escape is not one that has yet crossed my table, for this scenario or any other. So one thing you might want to do to prepare a party of pre-gen characters to survive this scenario is to include a more criminal element, one of Harris's old gang members, who is better at escaping than a straight-up fight. Of course, there is no guarantee they will survive that long. Survival may be overambitious for this scenario. The horror element is in the overall failure, at least when this is played as a straight-up Call of Cthulhu scenario rather than a pulp adventure. Still, a no-win scenario may not be for every group. Even for a horror game, I do like it when at least one character makes it back from the party, the sole survivor who lives to tell the tale. Furthermore, the possibility that they may have been the sole survivor may assuage the angst some players feel at their seemingly inevitable death or madness. Finally, speaking of where the fun is at, I have to commend Chaosium on presenting this adventure in a way that is pleasurable to read before play and yet provides succinct elements that can be referenced during play. There is still some work to do with some long text blocks that could be neatly summarized into simple conditional sentences as a reference later. But due credit must be given for a very well-formatted scenario that is fun to read.
What doesn't work?
Whilst there are a wealth of options available to players, There is a certain drag of inevitability about events, and with such a high bar of survival, let alone escaping with Jane Strong or thwarting Key, players may feel powerless to have events go otherwise than they do. This may seem a churlish complaint for a Call of Cthulhu scenario, but it felt particularly pronounced with this one. This may be partly down to the kind of investigators players prepare for this scenario. Even when you nudge them beforehand by asking them to put certain points into basic skills like navigation and tracking, the investigators may find themselves quickly failing in the basics. Whilst the story marches forward despite any failures, the situation is such that by the third day they feel like they are locked into a roller coaster ride with an inevitable conclusion. This may be thrilling to some, but not to all players' tastes. However, this is a minor criticism, and more an issue of mismatched expectations. The story as it plays out by default is worth telling and fitting for a horror scenario. I guess if I were to suggest some improvements you could make in running this, it would come down to giving more opportunities for the signposting to work in favor of the player characters. Firstly, the dreams provided may steer them away from the hideout cabin and close off the simplest avenue to getting some sense of closure by dealing with Harris. More so, the dreams are primarily useful in ramping up the psychic terror of the investigators and putting them into an even more tense state. It is, though, possible to use them to subtly nudge the investigators forward and forewarn them about what is to come. I ended up writing a few of my own dreams to both vary the dreams available, but also to give them some helpful, if cryptic, warnings about the dig site. Secondly, the dig site may appear as an option too early with the appearance of James Stanton's truck. Once the players get it into their head that this is a place of safety out of the woods, it will be hard for them to gather enough information to be prepared for what is to come. It may be an idea to have the truck only appear on the third day, after the investigators have already gone east towards the cabins. Some slight shifts in favor of the investigators would, I think, give a potential outcome where at least one of the investigators survive. Without forcing the matter, just leaving that possibility that an average group of players will have this preferable outcome is my general preference. Some groups may be just as happy with everyone dying and being turned into the servants of Glaki.
How it played.
Overall, the two groups I have run through this scenario seem to enjoy it a great deal. The atmosphere of the scenario was immense, and I managed to put together a playlist of music of increasing intensity for each day. I'm not sure either of the groups picked up on it, but day 1 and 2 there was the subtle background noise of birds, which all disappeared on day 3 when I turned off that particular track. The first group had some very unfortunate luck when it came to the encounters with the hunting party and with Eugene Clayton. By the second night, one of their number was dead, and the party were less thinking about finding Harris and rescuing Jane Strong than about getting out alive. The siren song of the dig site sealed their fate pretty quickly. The second group had better luck in those early encounters and went to Turner's cabin. Being more adventurous types, they continued to the lake shore and found the artist strapped to those poles. Their sanity already fraying, they were pushed over the edge with the fight with Turner and the other servants of the Great Old One. Those who survived that fight found themselves joining the artist as the Great Old One rose. Whilst most of those two groups enjoyed the scenario, I wouldn't be fully candid with you if I did not talk about the player who did not. One of my players was vocally miffed afterwards and thought the outcome was predetermined by me. That there was a story that I wanted to tell and I was determined to tell it. As this was the first scenario we had played together, this was a trust issue that was hard to do very much about after the fact. Internet-based groups are easy come and easy go, and there isn't often much opportunity for getting to know each other before judgments are made. As it happens, I understand the player's concerns. Alas, there was no opportunity to talk through them.
Make it your own.
This is a scenario that could easily be lifted and put into any setting. For the games I've been running, New England 1920s have worked very well. However, there is little here that depends on the nominal setting of Vermont or the 1920s. All it requires is some woods and a lake, plus a surveyor's site that has found some extraterrestrial crystal, plus various parties who become involved in a mundane plot that draws unsuspecting investigators into something that turn out to be more terrible than they can imagine. Many elements can be swapped out without impacting the main part of the adventure. You could easily replace the Turner Gang and the historical elements of deserters heading through Vermont to Canada with something appropriate to the local setting. Smugglers on the Cornish coast, partisans in Iberia, or a gang of slavers in West Africa. Likewise, the camp of artists can be replaced with other suitable unfortunate victims. A party of sightseers, a remote nunnery, or a commune of hippies. The kidnap plot works fairly well as a motivation, and criminals hiding in the wild woods can work equally well in all the aforementioned settings and a dozen more, no doubt. One challenge worth considering would be to shorten the scenario to fit into a single 4-hour session. Ideally, by the midpoint, the party should have received their second dream and the downward descent towards the conclusion would be underway. This means shortening the time before the manhunt starts, perhaps even completely discarding the scene setting of the posse. Start the investigators in the woods, looking for Harris and his gang. Give them a quick rundown of what they are doing there, and then with a little description of what at this stage seems like perfectly normal if ancient woods, have the first scene be them getting nearly shot by the father and son hunting party. This shortened run would give an additional reason to cut out the truck scene. A tighter pace may suit the story even better, although the risk is here that the whole thing seems even more on rails than it does currently.
And finally,
Amidst the Ancient Trees is a memorable horror story and generated moments that still stick in my mind. It also gives the keeper a canvas upon which to paint a chilling picture at a rather quickening pace. It has some great lore and the scenery that exemplifies the kind of Lovecraftian tale players will be drawn to play with using Call of Cthulhu. But it is not the best scenario to run first for a new group of players. For that, I would still recommend The Haunting, covered in episode 2 of this podcast. But for a keeper looking to flex their storytelling muscles and a group on board to tell an interesting story despite their characters' failures, it will be very satisfying. Thank you for listening to Run the Adventure with me, your host, Sid Razvi. I'd love to hear any feedback, questions, or your thoughts on this episode. You can reach me on email, gm@runtheadventure.com, or find me on Twitter at RTA_podcast. Until the next episode, may your adventure run fantastic.